In this episode, we're going to move from planning an impact assessment to actually performing one in a way that is disciplined, defensible, and useful for decision-making. People sometimes hear the word assessment and imagine a document that lives in a folder and never changes anything, but that is not what a good AI impact assessment should be. A strong assessment is more like a structured conversation that produces clear decisions, clear requirements, and clear proof that the organization behaved responsibly. It also helps teams avoid building something that later has to be paused, redesigned, or quietly abandoned because it cannot meet safety or compliance expectations. Since this certification is the AI Security Manager, AAISM, the exam expects you to know what an assessment looks like when it is done well, not just when it is mentioned in policy. By the end, you should understand how to define scope carefully, gather and evaluate evidence, and turn findings into concrete actions that improve the system and reduce risk. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good assessment begins by making scope precise, because a vague scope creates vague results and leads to false confidence. Scope is not only a sentence like "this system uses AI," because that tells you almost nothing about impact. Instead, scope should describe the use case, the decision context, the intended users, and the boundaries of what the system is allowed to do. It should also describe what the system touches, especially what data sources it can access, what outputs it produces, and where those outputs go next. When beginners skip this step, they often assess an imaginary system that is simpler and safer than the real one, which means the assessment cannot protect anyone. A useful habit is to state scope in a way that makes it easy to test later, such as specifying what types of decisions the system influences and what environments it will operate in. When the scope is written clearly, everyone involved can agree on what is being assessed, which prevents misunderstandings that appear later during review or audits. Once scope is set, the next step is to identify stakeholders and impact surfaces, because impact is not evenly distributed across everyone who touches the system. Stakeholders include people directly affected by outcomes, people who use the system to make decisions, people responsible for operating it, and people responsible for meeting legal and contractual obligations. Impact surfaces are the places where harm can occur, such as data collection, training, model behavior, outputs, and downstream usage of those outputs. Beginners often focus only on the model, but harm can occur even when the model is technically accurate if the workflow around it is unsafe. For example, an output might be used as a final decision without review, or a user might feed sensitive data into the system without understanding restrictions. Identifying stakeholders early helps you spot these workflow risks because it forces you to ask who could be harmed and how. It also helps you decide what evidence to gather, because evidence should reflect real usage, not just design intentions. A well-performed assessment treats stakeholders as part of the system, not as an afterthought. With stakeholders and impact surfaces identified, you move into risk and impact hypotheses, which is a practical way to list what could go wrong and why it would matter. Hypotheses are not guesses pulled from the air, but reasonable statements grounded in how the system works and what it touches. For example, you might hypothesize that outputs could reveal sensitive information if the system can access confidential documents. You might hypothesize that outcomes could be unfair if the training data reflects historical bias. You might hypothesize that the system could be misused if access controls are too broad or if acceptable use guidance is unclear. This stage benefits from being specific because vague statements like "it could be risky" do not lead to actionable controls. Beginners sometimes worry that listing many hypotheses makes the system look unsafe, but the opposite is true. Identifying plausible harms early is what makes the program defensible. The goal is not to prove the system is perfect, but to show the organization considered realistic harms and designed safeguards. This is where the assessment becomes a real risk management tool instead of a compliance ritual. Evidence gathering is the next major phase, and it is where assessments often succeed or fail because evidence determines whether conclusions are trustworthy. Evidence in an AI impact assessment includes system documentation, data descriptions, model details at an appropriate level, workflow diagrams or descriptions, governance approvals, and validation results. It can also include policy requirements, regulatory obligations, and contract commitments that apply to the system's use and data. Beginners should understand that evidence is not only technical artifacts, because governance evidence matters too, such as who owns the system, what review checkpoints exist, and what change control process is used. Evidence should also include what users are expected to do, such as guidance on acceptable use and training materials that prevent misuse. The assessment team should avoid relying on informal statements like "we are careful," because those cannot be tested and do not satisfy defensibility. Instead, evidence should be something you can point to and say this existed at the time of assessment. Strong evidence collection also reduces future confusion because it creates a record of what assumptions were supported and what gaps were discovered. Data evidence deserves special attention because data is often the largest driver of impact, and data problems can create harm even when the model is well designed. A thorough assessment examines what data will be used, where it comes from, how it is classified, and what controls protect it across the life cycle. If the system uses personal data, the assessment should document the presence of personally identifiable information, PII, and describe what obligations apply, such as purpose limits, access restrictions, and retention requirements. Data evidence also includes provenance, meaning whether the organization can trace sources and understand licensing, consent, and quality. Another crucial area is integrity evidence, meaning what safeguards exist to prevent tampering or accidental corruption of datasets. Beginners sometimes assume that data is static, but in many systems data evolves, new sources are added, and records are refreshed, which can change risk over time. A good assessment captures not only what data is used now, but how data changes will be governed and monitored. When data evidence is strong, the assessment can make clearer, more defensible decisions about controls and oversight. Model and system behavior evidence is also essential, but it should be collected in a way that supports governance decisions rather than becoming a technical deep dive. The assessment should document what type of model is being used, what its intended functions are, and what limitations are known or expected. Evidence should include validation results that show the system performs acceptably for its purpose, as well as testing that looks for unsafe behavior, such as producing sensitive outputs or behaving inconsistently under stress. If the system relies on a vendor model or external service, the assessment should include evidence about vendor obligations, change practices, and what monitoring or notification mechanisms exist. Beginners should be careful not to confuse impressive outputs with safe outputs, because a system can sound confident while being incorrect or inappropriate. Evidence should therefore include not only performance measures, but also safety measures and monitoring plans that detect unacceptable behavior. This is also where you capture version details, because without version clarity, you cannot reliably connect behavior to decisions later. A well-run assessment treats model evidence as part of accountability, not as a curiosity. After gathering evidence, the assessment must evaluate impacts systematically, which means you compare what you found against obligations, principles, and risk tolerance. This is where many assessments become weak if they simply restate evidence without judging what it means. Evaluation includes determining whether identified hypotheses are likely, how severe the harm would be, and what safeguards currently exist. It also includes identifying gaps, meaning where evidence is missing, controls are absent, or responsibilities are unclear. A helpful approach is to separate current state from required state, because that makes gaps visible and actionable. Beginners sometimes think evaluation is about finding one big pass or fail, but mature assessments produce nuanced results, such as acceptable with conditions or unacceptable until specific changes are made. Evaluation should also consider the decision context, because a small error rate can be acceptable in a low-impact convenience tool, but unacceptable in a high-impact decision system. This is where risk assessment, RA, thinking overlaps, because you are considering likelihood and impact, but the impact assessment keeps the focus on consequences to people and business outcomes. Strong evaluation produces decisions that a responsible leader can explain and defend. Turning evaluation into actionable results is the moment the assessment becomes valuable, because action is what reduces risk and supports compliance. Actionable results are specific changes or controls that must be implemented, along with ownership and timelines. Instead of saying improve privacy, an actionable result might require narrowing access to sensitive data sources, updating retention rules for prompts and outputs, and verifying controls through a defined review. Instead of saying address fairness, an actionable result might require additional evaluation across relevant groups, documentation of mitigation steps, and periodic monitoring triggers if outcome patterns shift. Instead of saying improve governance, an actionable result might assign a named system owner, require a completed approval checkpoint before deployment, and define change control expectations for model updates. Beginners should notice that actionable results are not only technical, because process and documentation actions often matter as much as access controls or monitoring. Each action should be traceable to a risk or obligation identified earlier, so it does not feel arbitrary. This traceability is what makes the assessment defensible, because you can show how findings became controls and how controls reduce harm. A strong impact assessment also produces decision outputs, meaning it clearly states what can proceed, what must pause, and what conditions are required before the next milestone. Decision outputs should be written in language that executives and project teams can understand, because unclear decisions lead to inconsistent execution. A common and useful structure is to state whether the system is approved to proceed with conditions, or not approved until specific remediation occurs. Beginners should understand that conditional approval is often the most realistic outcome, because it allows progress while ensuring risk is reduced in a controlled way. Conditions should be specific and testable, such as requiring completion of an evidence artifact, implementing a control, or adjusting scope. Decision outputs should also identify who has authority to accept residual risk, if any remains after mitigation, because residual risk acceptance is a governance responsibility, not a technical one. Clear decisions prevent the assessment from becoming a report that nobody acts on. When exam questions ask what makes an assessment effective, clear decision outputs and conditions are often part of the correct reasoning. Evidence does not end with collecting artifacts, because the assessment itself must produce evidence about how it was performed, which supports defensibility later. That includes documenting who participated, what scope was assessed, what evidence was reviewed, what tests were performed, and what rationale supports the conclusions. Beginners sometimes worry that documenting rationale is too formal, but rationale is simply the explanation of why a decision was made based on evidence and risk considerations. This documentation matters because AI systems evolve, and later reviewers may not remember the original context. If an incident occurs, the organization needs to show that it performed due diligence and that decisions were not reckless. Assessment evidence also supports continuous improvement, because future assessments can build on past findings rather than starting over. A well-documented assessment becomes part of the program's memory, helping governance routines remain consistent even when people change roles. This is particularly important in AI governance because systems may remain in use for years while teams rotate. Assessment process evidence is therefore a form of organizational resilience. Another key element of performing impact assessments well is managing uncertainty honestly, because no assessment can prove a complex AI system will never cause harm. Instead of pretending uncertainty does not exist, a mature assessment identifies assumptions and defines monitoring and triggers to catch problems early. For example, if the system depends on a stable data distribution, the assessment should note that drift could change outcomes and require monitoring to detect it. If the system relies on user behavior, the assessment should note that misuse could create risk and require acceptable use guidance and monitoring for suspicious patterns. Beginners often think admitting uncertainty makes an assessment weak, but the opposite is true. Acknowledging uncertainty and building safeguards is a sign of maturity. This is also where assessment results connect to operational routines like periodic review and change control, because uncertainty is managed over time, not only at launch. By making assumptions explicit, the assessment creates a clear list of what must be watched and what changes require reassessment. that turns uncertainty into a manageable set of conditions rather than an invisible danger. Impact assessments also need to integrate smoothly with governance routines, because an assessment that sits outside normal work becomes easy to ignore. Integration means the assessment is triggered by intake, scaled by risk tiering, reviewed at approval checkpoints, and refreshed during periodic reviews or major changes. It also means assessment findings flow into program tracking so leadership can see what risks are being addressed and what remains open. Beginners should recognize that governance integration is what prevents compliance from being an afterthought, because it ensures assessments happen early and consistently. Integration also supports efficiency because teams can reuse templates, evidence repositories, and standard evaluation methods rather than reinventing the process each time. Another benefit is fairness across teams, because consistent assessment processes prevent one team from being held to a higher standard just because a different reviewer was involved. When assessments are integrated into routines, they become part of how the organization does AI, not a special obstacle that appears only when someone is worried. That normalizing effect is a major goal of Task 8 because it reduces bypass and strengthens defensibility. An effective assessment also pays attention to communication and usability, because a report that nobody understands will not change behavior. Communication means writing findings and actions in clear language, explaining why each action matters, and ensuring stakeholders know what is required and by when. It also means clearly distinguishing what is mandatory from what is recommended, because ambiguity leads to partial compliance and inconsistent outcomes. Beginners may think the technical team will automatically interpret the assessment correctly, but different teams often read the same text differently, especially under time pressure. A good assessment, therefore, includes clarity about ownership, such as who implements a control, who verifies it, and who signs off that it is done. Communication also includes setting expectations for follow-up, such as when evidence will be rechecked and what triggers additional review. When assessments communicate clearly, they become a practical tool for coordination rather than a dense artifact that people skim. This also strengthens exam performance, because many questions test whether you can choose actions that create clarity and accountability, not just actions that sound protective. As we wrap up, performing AI impact assessments with scope, evidence, and actionable results is about turning risk awareness into disciplined decision-making that can be proven later. You begin by defining scope precisely, so everyone knows what is being assessed and what impacts are plausible. You identify stakeholders and impact surfaces so you do not miss workflow risks that can cause harm even when the model seems fine. You gather strong evidence about data, model behavior, governance, and operations, then evaluate impacts honestly against obligations and risk tolerance. Most importantly, you convert findings into actionable controls, own tasks, and clear decision outputs that guide whether the system can proceed and under what conditions. You document the assessment process itself so the organization has defensible proof of due diligence and a memory for continuous improvement. When uncertainty exists, you make it explicit and manage it through monitoring, triggers, and reassessment routines rather than pretending it does not matter. This disciplined approach is what Task 8 is really testing, because it shows you can make compliance and safety part of real work, not a rushed reaction at the end.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.